Okay, welcome to what will be the last episode of this little expose. I thought I'd be able to do it in one sitting, but it's actually, what are we down? 2 hours in already, and we've still got probably at least another half hour to go. But I will make this the last episode, where we now look at the actual graphic treatments, the advice it sort of gives about design, which is really quite interesting as well, I think, and also then sort of moving forward into other examples, which is still applicable today, very, very applicable today. So we're just going to cover design, leaflets and folders. So covers for small scale publications should be, by the way, if you're coming out of this one cold, we're looking at the NASA worm logo, which has just been reinstated. This was back from when it was designed back in the mid-1970s. And so we're looking at the style guide from the 1970s and just having a bit of a discussion about, I'm really looking forward to the comments actually, to sort of see what you guys think about, I guess my aspect of it, or my vision of how this was sort of done, and whether you sort of disagree or agree, or how you sort of look at these sorts of things. So covers for small scale publications should be thought of as posters in miniature. Yes, 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 yes. That's still applicable today, and it's something that with clients and with anybody, I try to get them to realize that they've got to simplify to get a message that will communicate, and then work backwards from that point. You have to distill it down. I love this. Because we've got digital format now, we can do anything you like. We lose that aspect when we sort of design in a computer. You've got to really think about what you're communicating and distill it down. This is such good stuff. So covers for small scale publications should be thought of as posters in miniature. Because of a small amount of space, a designer should attempt to reduce the number of competitive elements and strive for simplicity. This will require the cooperation of editorial colleagues so that the cover can be clear, direct and attractive. And this is still so important. In fact, this is more applicable now than even in this era. We live in an era where we're just absolutely inundated with messages. Advertising today is just a mess. Primarily, it's very hard to sort of compete with the amount of signage that we see. Everywhere we go, we're just absolutely assaulted because it's so easy to generate publication materials. And so we've got all of this stuff that's coming back to us. But the overriding thing is that it's so much of it is complicated. Like you look at a sign as you're driving along the highway. Some signs are great and it's nice and simple, got the most distilled message possible. Other signs are an absolute mess. And so thinking of them as posters is such a good way to start any design process when you're trying to actually get across an actual specific communication. And so, so the principle of this is just so important, more important today than it was back in the 1970s. This is a really, really good, God, this is such a good document. When brochures are to be published in a series, it is advisable to plan ahead so the coordinated family look might emerge. Actually, the word family look is something you don't hear much of anymore, but certainly back in the 1990s, 2000s, having a family approach to things was actually important. And so it was a slightly different terminology back then, because by that stage, we were starting to sort of see, back in the 70s, the 60s, 70s and 80s, logos were set in stone. You could not change them, even into the 1990s. Once you had a logo, you did not break that format. And certainly even now today for big corporates, for multinationals and things like that, they do actually have a logo style that has to be conformed to. They can't break it. But for medium-sized businesses and small businesses, nowadays you can really do a lot, because the brand is no longer just thought of as your visual communication. Your brand is actually how you present to an actual, like to your audience. And so you can present your communication in different ways, and the logo is now pretty much considered to be part of that communication. So it's still going to be treated with a lot of care, but you don't have the same constraints. And so the word family, the family look, was all designed around, keeping the fonts consistent and things like that. But it also did allow some variance sometimes with the logos. It's just funny how things change over time. How different eras sort of look at the way that different words sort of mean things slightly differently as we sort of move forward. Nowadays, again, like we sort of see things that are just wildly different, where the actual family look is just thrown out the window. And I think that's a mistake. I still think that simplicity is very, very important. Consistency is very important. Impact is incredibly important. These are sorts of things that with good design, you can actually achieve that. So in the demonstrations below, note that all examples incorporate the NASA logo type and identification down through here. In fact, they've reversed the size, where that actually goes. That's interesting, actually, that they've done that. I'll talk about that in just a second, actually, because that is quite fascinating. The proper coordination of type, photography and illustration will ensure that small covers have the impact of larger pieces. It's very dangerous to do this, where you actually show an example of something that you don't really want somebody that doesn't know what they're doing to actually have a look at it. Also notice that the NASA, they've actually now got it where the NASA was, this is actually bigger than what the NASA was back in the other examples, and this is actually smaller than what it was in other examples. This is the same size as what we saw originally. So this is actually quite fascinating to sort of see what they've done through here. They've used the word organisation as the limit for trying to make it into a graphic block. So they've actually gone away from their consistency with what they're actually sort of showing. And so, yeah, in the earlier part of the document, we sort of saw this was actually presented quite differently. And they would never have done this where they reversed the size. So they've gone away from their graphic treatment, but they have a reason for doing it. But it's interesting that they would show an example of that, because that should be something that would be done differently. And so you can see through here, the NASA down the bottom there is an anchoring device. And so you're drawn from the space shuttle through the graphic down to the NASA. If the NASA was around the other way, you would still end at the NASA but not read the other bits. This is sort of like creates like a solid base for the other text above it. And so it's a right place to do it. But it's funny that they would use that as an example of what you can do if you're actually using their graphic style, because you don't want to be sort of showing, oh yeah, you can change the size around, go to town. Because back in the earlier part, you know, they're really quite strict, or you know, it appears to be very strict about the size dimensions and how things actually should work. And so they've sort of gone away from this very explicit style to then showing something much looser for their actual graphic style. And the other thing that's interesting about this as well, and I suspected that this was the case, is that they've actually used a different font here as opposed to here. See how much thinner this one is? This one looks like Helvetica extra, like Helvetica New Extra Light. Helvetica New, I think, came out around about this time. I think it came out about this time. And so they're mixing their fonts, even though they haven't actually mentioned it in the example. And I've seen this a little bit in this document where they've actually done that. So they haven't conformed to explicitly you must do this, which is quite interesting, because within a decade you would not see this. It would have to conform to its own graphic standards, because otherwise you'd end up with too many designers then taking liberties, and you can't have that. Like with these sorts of, the whole idea is you keep consistency and you keep it under control. So that's quite interesting. This is sort of funny as well. Like they've got things sort of where they're splitting things up with the Apollo-Soyuz, where they're sort of coming in together. It's just an interesting sort of graphic treatment. It doesn't look good for me. Like I don't like the break through there. And it's quite funny how they're trying to get direction through the use of the contrast in through here with the black on the white, you know, and then sort of fading it off, and then actually sort of just overlaying over the top to just try to get some sort of graphic treatment. For me, it's not something that you would be really. It wouldn't be good to see that nowadays. Like that's not something that would be of any real great interest. But it does try to portray movement. So this is certainly a reflection of the 1970s. Hang on, down through here. What did man do on the moon? What did man on the moon do for man on the Earth? What they've tried, this is interesting as well, just the way that they've actually split this. You wouldn't see this nowadays either. So what did, what you'd see nowadays is what did man on the moon do for man on the Earth would be the way that you'd sort of see that went done. What they've tried to do, and this is actually a bit of a hallmark back to when everything was done manually, they've tried to make the statements man on the moon, man on the Earth stand out more by actually having the breaks where they actually have this one now, which sort of looks funny when you look at it, but it actually, the man on the moon, man on the Earth, you end up with the alliterations of getting the two words man in through there, and so it still sort of works. It's more of a graphic way of doing things, but as I say, today we wouldn't bother. You would just set the font however it came through. Maybe some people might sort of consider trying to do something like that, but having said that, even by the 1980s, having big gaps like this coming back in actually made it more difficult with the legibility. So even by the 1980s, you would actually have the man up above there and the man up above there, just to sort of try to get like a bit more of a solid sort of treatment. Would sort of be how that would be. It would be handled differently, even just within 10 years of this thing being done. Again, it's got the interesting thing with that base down through this side, where it's got the text reversed out of the darkness. Again, this is all just done in the bromide cameras, sort of photographically, trying to sort of get things to sort of work. This one's interesting because it is sort of so much smaller than what it was on the other pages, but again, they've used it as a design treatment because they needed to have their hierarchy of elements. Is number 1 is NASA, number 2 is the actual, what this one is called, number 3 is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So instead of having that up nice and large where it was with the other examples, like in the other page that we had a look at, which would then compete with this, they've actually used design to actually do that. But again, it's interesting to sort of see how they've done that, how they've actually done that treatment, because it doesn't conform to their style guide, which is sort of quite funny. And again, we've got another one through here where they're just sort of using sort of like a graphic treatment. Back in the 70s, this is all you could really sort of do to fairly quickly get a result. Again, they've got the smaller NASA. I don't know why that's so small there. I would have thought that should be almost competing with this text in some sort of sense. Not as big as this, of course, but it's certainly funny to have that as your in terms of the actual text hierarchy. You've got the film catalogue. Again, see how close everything is. It's really hard to read. You wouldn't do that nowadays. You'd actually put a little bit of air in between the actual lettering just to sort of allow it to breathe a little bit, because this is very, very claustrophobic. Everything they've done is extremely claustrophobic with everything, basically, except for here. See how this is actually fairly clean and open. It's very much more legible than the examples that they've actually given, which is very interesting to sort of see that actually, like just with the this is a much nicer approach than the actual examples that they've provided. As I say, this you would actually, that would be considered a mistake nowadays to actually have, and quite often these fonts at this stage, I'm just trying to think, because you didn't have your digital typesetting. It'd be interesting to actually sort of typeset these now in a computer using the actual fonts and just compare it, just to see what the actual automatic kerning does. And the automatic kerning in a digital font, is actually preset. Like they actually have it all set up, and so it would be fun. It would be fascinating to do that. Actually, I might, if I've got time, I might try to remember to actually give that a go and see what actually comes when I actually put these side by side with fonts straight out of a computer, with the actual kerning done from the settings of the actual digital font as opposed to the original font that was then done in the actual typesetting machine. And this could have also been done by manually, like people may have even done this manually with like Letraset rub-on lettering. Okay, next one we have is the cover design journals and technical publications. And so we've got covers for publications in this category are straightforward, simple, and devoid of frills. This is the ideal approach to publications that are vehicles for scientific information and research data. The covers shown below employ the STEM word used, which is this word through here, used word use of the NASA logo type. Competitive elements have been reduced and attention has been given to proper emphasis on centre and accreditation and headline treatment. Standards such as the use of an outline box around all diagrams will help organise the covers. So they've just got different ways of sort of then presenting this one. But again, this is quite nice design. You can see here we've now got the spacing back and through this side, but this is centred between the two. It's not gravitating down towards the actual text. And this one in particular is actually quite, without knowing where the text sort of fills off, this one's gravitating up towards the line. So actually maybe it is the centre, so maybe that's okay. It's sort of funny there's no headline with this one down through this side. Anyway, we'll continue on. These, as I say, they could be Helvetica light, but they could also be extra light. It's a bit hard to sort of tell with the reproduction that's happened through there. So cover design, news publications. So mastheads for news publications are strong, attractive and uncluttered. Attention should be paid to the various typesetting elements so that things are read in the proper order. Now these could have been 4-colour processes that it's actually sort of showing. Now this is weird. We'll have to have a bit of a talk about this in a second. Ownership of the publication is paramount and should be followed by the titling of a lead article. So paragraphs and illustrations which appear on covers should be selected for their content, impact and graphic value. Unless the subject possesses these attributes, it will be an ineffective cover image. Still more relevant today than it was back in this era. The covers below demonstrate the use of the NASA logo type on various centre and agency-wide publications. So they've got the STEM word back over through this side. It's funny that looks like it's actually slightly taller than the actual NASA itself, but that may be just my eye. I'm not sure. It's funny that they've actually bled the Langley off the top, which then puts a lot of weight down below. And it's not a good way of doing this, and I don't know why they would have done it. I'm just assuming that must be something from the 1970s that they thought was a good idea back then. Because what that does is then the only reason you do it is think I want it to gravitate up towards the masthead, but then you've got all this white space, like so much white space there. So it doesn't work as a gravitational device where it's gravitating up into this actual space. It doesn't separate from here. It just looks wrong. It needs to have more of the black to then sort of balance out the big thick gap you have through here with the thin gap that you have through this side. It just doesn't work. So it's the actual line itself is gravitating down towards the story rather than it being an actual masthead. So the whole thing should be up there with the gap. The main gap should be in here, I think. So yeah, for me this doesn't work as a design, but I'm thinking once again 1970s. It's sort of outside of my realm of expertise, I guess, but it is sort of fairly interesting. So sort of see how they've actually done it. Again, the gravitation between this line and this gap, it looks wrong to me. It looks like this gap is too thick. There's too much in here simply because it bleeds into so much more in through this side. I prefer to see that line given sort of almost up to this line here with the image taking up more space. Would be sort of the way I'd feel more comfortable if I was the art director on that particular job. So these to me aren't good examples of design. There'd be a lot of things I'd be sending it back to the finished artists back of that era and say no. Not good enough. Do it again. This one looks to have a little bit more air than some of the others that we've seen actually, which is sort of interesting. Just the kerning the tracking between the actual letters themselves. So anyway, that's actually kerning is the actual individual lettering between them, and tracking is the overall setting for the actual font itself. So anyway, and it's just funny that this is now tiny down through here. Again, it doesn't need it, but I'm wondering why they went with the block and not the wider version. That would actually work better as the wider version. They could have actually made that a little bit bigger. It's also quite often you wouldn't see the date and the volume presented this way. You'd almost sort of get rid of that, put it over in the gap over this side on the right hand side, close that gap up, or maybe just make the graphic the whole treatment, with this actually then being a little bit bigger and possibly just on the 2-line version. That's just sort of the way I'd be sort of looking at it, I guess. Interesting over here, they've been told not to do this, yet here they go, but they've actually put the National Aeronautics and Space Administration away from the actual logo itself, so that's actually quite an interesting change. Again, it doesn't conform to what they've told people to do in their document. Oh, I'm a design Nazi, aren't I? I'm a design Nazi. Here we go. So we'll just keep on going. So cover design, quality publications. So covers in this category are dramatic and appealing. The main purpose of the cover is to attract the reader and serve as an effective preview of what is to follow. It is, in one sense, a package problem, and both front and back covers should be considered part of the package. Concepts play an important role in quality publications and should be explored thoroughly. Special attention must be paid to the quality of the photograph or illustration as well as the content. Superior quality will help distinguish the cover from other competitive publications. So, and number 4, it's got 4-color process printing here. It's funny, I've never seen it with the 4/ color, but they've used that consistently through the document. For me, it was always 4- or just 4-color. Like there was never this actual slash. So I was never exposed to that sort of treatment. So 4-color process printing is desirable whenever possible to contribute to the general effect and prestige of the publication. While it's impossible to show demonstrations in colour, all of the covers below were designed in 4-color process. Interesting it actually specified that, because this is actually something that was quite often, even in other style manuals, you'd still sort of see them in this era and in the next decade or two, where they wouldn't use actual colour. They would still just use black and white examples because of the cost of actually reproducing them, because you didn't have digital printing back then. You didn't have short run printing. Everything had to be printed in big runs. Note that space has been used to separate the mission patch from the NASA logo type. So mission patch, there we go, up there I guess, just keeping it on opposite ends. Again, interesting the way that they've sort of done that. Can't really see much what's going on through there. NASA, the future, this balance looks way out for me. I don't like the look of this at all. This one's not big enough to dominate this, yet it's not small enough to equalise with it as well. It's certainly the more important in the hierarchy of the graphic of the text elements, you know, with the logo and the headline. But you would not see that today. You would see a massive, an extra light version of it, maybe sort of ghosted across somewhere else, and then the NASA would probably be bigger, maybe sort of done in a different way. The future maybe sort of running up or down somewhere else with NASA as a sign off or something. But this hierarchy doesn't look good from a more modern sort of treatment of actual design hierarchies. So yeah, that for me they fight together. So that would be a reject as well. I wouldn't approve that one. Then back in through this side, it's very hard to sort of see what's going on through there. It looks like it's trying to be tricky on the something of. I like that. This is actually something that we saw very prevalently in the early 2000s, where there was very tricky typography, and it was compelling to read, and you don't see it much anymore, which is sort of surprising, because where typography would become the graphics. And I quite like this. This is actually a really simple way of doing it. It would almost be better if it was the other way around, because we're actually doing it in a reverse direction. Quite often your eye wants to lead into here and then exit the page down the bottom here. So it is preferable to have the logo down there. In fact, even moving the logo across there would probably still help that, because you've then just got the world anchoring everything, with NASA then being the sign off for the typography. But where it is now, it's you come in, you don't know where to look, because you're coming in, you know that you're supposed to be looking at this stuff, but the hierarchy is dictating that once you get past the graphic, you're down here to NASA, then you're bouncing back up again. If NASA was down the bottom here, you'd be coming in, using the world to then sort of come back through, read your typography, and then sign off at the NASA. So again, if it was me designing that, I'd be changing the look of that. I wouldn't have the of as anywhere near as close there as well. I'd have it sort of more over this way, and probably bring that one in a little bit as well, just to try to sort of make it a little bit more legible. But having said that, the whole idea is to grab attention, and that's interesting for this era, because that's not something you would see in the 1970s. Certainly in the 1990s, you would start to see that, and in the early 2000s, you'd see a lot of it. Hard to see what's going on through that one. All right, here we go. So cover design, case-bound and educational publications. So case-bound covers are kept simple with heavy emphasis on typography. They should project a certain classic or timeless look and cannot be over-embellished. A careful attention to publication techniques will ensure a more successful overall package. It's advisable to use the NASA logo type instead of inside the publication rather than on the cover, thus achieving better reproduction. It is advisable to use a NASA logo type inside the publication rather than on the cover, thus achieving better reproduction. So they've actually gone away from it here. That's interesting. Okay, educational publications can rely on typography in a fairly direct manner. The title is the most important consideration and can be handled in a contemporary way without pretentious frills. That's not something that you'd see after this era. The 1970s, you could sort of pretty much do anything. As I say, this was the era of bubble text. This here, done on a computer, is now something that's so easy to do. This here, back in this era, was not easy to do. You had to actually do this by rolling the type in the bromide camera to achieve the same sort of thing. I mean, it wasn't difficult to do, but it was not something you could actually tweak. Like, it was something you'd have to sort of have a look through the actual top, and then try to get that one sort of done that way. But it's sort of funny how computers have now emulated this. So photography in space, we don't know what else was actually underneath there. It's funny looking at the graphic styles, the graphic treatments. I was actually trained to sketch in different sorts of styles in this sort of style when I was going through university. They had all sorts of different ways of doing it. This was one of these sort of like sketchy sort of styles of doing things, because back in this era and in the era that followed, it was an easy way to get reproduction fairly quickly. In an era where it was more difficult to get photography than illustration. So it's funny to sort of see these sorts of treatments, which are now, they're not even good. You know, like, they would do it differently now. They would do it differently because of the way that the illustration styles have changed over time. You could still do it rough like this, but it wouldn't be this rough. It would be done actually even more rough. And it's funny to sort of see it. They've got like space mathematics, a resource for teachers. See how that's gravitating off towards the right up to the very, very top. You see this a lot nowadays as well, but for me that's a real problem. This should be gravitating towards leading to what they're actually talking about in through here. The sign off again is okay because you've established a strong grid line through this side, but the space mathematics for me would work much, much better if it was dropped down, because it would then create the hierarchy would be space mathematics, bang, then you read the secondary element. At the moment, you hit this, it's right at the very top. It's wanting to float off the top of the actual page. And really, at that point, it feels uncomfortable. And so you don't really read the rest of it. So that, for me, is not a good design. And the Apollo 11 one as well, I sort of find it funny that they've actually put it above the text. It doesn't look good to me. They've actually used the Garamond in this instance as the actual font itself. And it does, for me, it doesn't work. Like the Apollo 11 should be, like anything to do with these sorts of things, you're going to get a much better result just by using the Helvetica, or even in this case, I mean, the Apollo program, I think, used Futura on their badges, and so I think that the Futura would be much more appropriate if that's what they used on their badges. So whatever they use as a font on their badges would work better. But also this one being in stark black and white. Like nowadays, you'd actually, if you're going to do it even with the same graphic treatment, you'd be using like a two-tone effect or something like that, where you're actually using much more muted colours to sort of achieve what you're seeing through here. Wow, we're running out of time. Still running out of time. So press kits and directories. The main elements of the design of the press kits in layout, typography, and logo type signature. Other visual motifs are unnecessary and may be in conflict with the material inside the kit. This is an area of design which is best served if the graphics are modern but not elaborate. The main function of a directory is to convey data and information in a concise and effective manner. Most directories will have a very plain interiors. There is potential to apply a graphic device, illustration, or photograph on the cover. One example of this is shown in the demonstrations below. Again, remember that this could have been done in colour. And so these are, again, it's interesting to see how poorly they've used the gravitation. I use the word gravitation. There's other words for it, but it's a relationship of graphic elements within the page itself, and just how tight they are on the outside edge. And this is actually a real hallmark of what happened when people started to do digital design. They lost all sense of elements wanting to gravitate towards each other. This is good. This is great. We've got really solid base with the NASA. Great. The thing I don't like is that this one should be a little bit further to the right than to the left, just rather than sort of centering it that way. But it still looks great. The Viking looks great through here as well. This is fine having this one off because it's just saying, hey, I'm going to keep out of Viking's way. I'm just going to let this one be the hero, and we're just going to stay away. We don't have to. This one doesn't need to gravitate towards this. This one here provides a really nice little comfortable sort of area where it's saying, look, I'm separate from NASA, but we're still actually up through here. You've got like a 1/3, 2/3 sort of relationship, which is quite a nice little rule of thumb actually to sort of use that when you're trying to sort of get separation, but still keep it balanced on the actual page itself. And this, for me, looks very, very nice. So I really like this design. This one here, gravitating way off the top. Doesn't really work. I can certainly understand why they've gone in the bottom left here, because they've actually got everything has been arranged left, ragged, right, which we've spoken about when we were looking at the actual logos. This one's pretty good. Again, I would be probably dropping this one down slightly, moving this one away from the top, just so, again, so that the actual gravitation is coming back down towards the logo. Again, they've actually bastardized the use of it. In fact, it would probably be better to put it back where it's supposed to be, which is underneath here, and then try to keep some sort of consistency with the actual point size with this as well. Make this a little bit larger, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. In fact, what they could have done is actually done what they did over through here, put the NASA at the bottom, put this at the top, make this one the same point size as this, and then actually have that one sort of so that it's still just a graphic treatment along with the actual NASA logo, so that this becomes the what it's all about. This is, of course, a telephone directory that they actually had. So kids, do you know what a telephone directory is? I don't think we've had them for about 10 years. And again, the gravitating off the top of the page here is a big issue for me. Yeah, it's sort of, and this looks too small for what it actually is. Lewis Research Centre, as part of NASA. See how the grid lines, you've got the grid line through there, which works, but then this one doesn't relate at all to the actual grid lines coming off the Lewis Research Centre. So that doesn't work at all. Like there's no strong grid lines anywhere. You'd almost be better off redesigning the whole thing, having Lewis Research Centre maybe in that sort of size, move this one underneath it, but leave a bit of a gap, and then just use the strong horizontal like they did that here. They see how this really strong horizontal just works well, even though the actual elements don't look like they're in the right sort of position. This one for me also then smacks for the same problem, where they've actually got the where they've got too many elements sort of happening that aren't gravitating toward, they're not relating to each other at all. They're actually saying, hey, keep it well away from me. This is social distancing in 1975 or 1976, whenever this was actually done. Again, this one as well, like the wrong font. I'd be sort of saying, no, you've got to use your Helvetica here. Use it like this was. They've got the Ames Research Centre telephone directory. Again, would be much better if that was bigger and done as more of a graphic treatment. Again, it's gravitating off the top. The use of the phone through here, yeah, no problem. It looks like that's actually just been put. That could be a 4-colour job. Probably wouldn't be though. It's probably just been put. Probably someone got a phone and put it inside the brain light camera to get that one. I'm just trying to see where the lights are coming from. You should have lights on either side. Yeah, you do. See how you've got lights shining in there and there that would have been put on the side. Light shining back through there. You've actually only got it coming in from one side. You don't actually have it on the other side, so maybe it wasn't put in the brain light camera. It's hard to tell. Anyway, that's that one. Posters are a vital and effective form of visual communication. Immediacy of the most important single element. Immediacy is the most important single element in poster design, so it is important to avoid conflicts which will compromise the effect. This is so important. This is such an important principle of design that is forgotten nowadays, and it's largely forgotten nowadays. Immediacy is the most important single element in poster design. Nowadays, we've got to consider every single thing we do, because there's so much information out there. Everything has to be treated as a poster. You have to think of it as a poster first and then sort of try to get whatever else you have to do. So that immediate communication is just so critical. This is such good stuff. Like, this is gold. This is often principles don't change over time, but we've lost sight in recent decades of these principles, but these principles still hold true. They held true back in the 1950s when sort of advertising was just sort of kicking on, through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Then we hit the digital age and we forgot it all. And so we're starting to learn it again now, but this is just such an important principle. Simple, bold headlines along with uncomplicated graphics can produce the desired results. And it can produce that, but you can do it other ways. But it still comes down to immediacy, being the immediacy of the communication elements being the important thing. Remember that the logo type / identification must be large enough and positioned well for good readership and retention. And so this is a compelling image. It draws you in, getting space technology down to Earth. Again, the gravitation, like where the positioning of this is, it's too far off to the edge because it wants to disappear. You know, like I'd be wanting it to be in a bit closer, and this up a little bit larger. I think they've got other elements down this way as well, which is fine, because by this stage you've already got your attention grabbed. But when you've got it gravitating off the page like this instead of gravitating into the image itself, because of the positioning of it, it sort of doesn't draw you into reading more. It actually, subconsciously, it pushes you out of the page. This is as well, it's the same thing. It's going off the top of the actual page itself. And again, look, I'm judging it on the way I was trained, and also because I did work in advertising agencies as an art director and as a creative director, and so this is the sort of stuff that I would be very, very conscious of not letting through. If for any of the finished artists that would sort of come to me, or even the other designers, if they were coming through with stuff, it would be no, can't have that. It was one of these the gravity of elements, and I keep on calling it that. I know that there's other terms for it, but the gravity of elements was one of the very, very few designers actually understood what it was and understood how important it was. But it works incredibly importantly subconsciously, and this is sort of like where this is quite interesting as well. Like, we've got the NASA information back over here. These are gravitating towards each other, but in an uncomfortable way. So weather satellites, 1960 to 1975, 15 years of progress. It would almost work better if this was larger, this was equivalently larger as well, and you actually had equal gaps between the elements, and having it down a little bit further. This can still be small. They've tried to sort of see how they've actually tried to keep the height of that looks about the same, but then this one doesn't. So this one could be even bigger again. That way you get a graphic grid line coming off the base, and then just have equal treatment with the actual, because you don't really need them gravitating away from each other, or close the gap even more. Have weather satellites and in fact, what you could do, which they wouldn't have done it back through here, but you could have actually had it range right, ragged left with the weather satellites. Have it the same height for the lettering as this treatment, as this one as well, and then actually do it so that it becomes a much closer gap, and you've then still got the relationships that are working a bit more effectively. Anyway, I hope people don't mind me actually picking this stuff to pieces, but that's the way I would not have let that through when I had people that were working underneath me. The grid, what is it? This one talks about design grids, which is actually something, again, that people don't really understand, because they don't need to understand it. I mean, I've seen probably in the last decade this has started to come back in again. So a grid is a predetermined understructure which a designer can employ to give the publication cohesive style and character. It's a great organizer, and we've been talking about grids all the way through, because grids are really the structure of design. It has to anchor off certain other elements. They have to relate to each other. Otherwise, they don't have to relate to each other. You can sort of do it whichever way, but whatever you're doing, you're actually communicating certain things by having the structure. By having the structure, it gives you so much more flexibility to then break the structure. And so if you have a very, very strong structure and then put something outside the structure, you gain focus on that element. And so that's why grids are just so important. For me, it's one of the hallmarks of good design is to actually make sure that you've got a very, very solid relationship between elements through whether it be through a grid or some sort of hierarchy, or some sort of way of actually creating an actual story through the actual relationship. Anyway, and then actually going off from there and sort of then trying to find an element that you're trying to then sort of get a focus on, and then possibly breaking the grid at that point. So, what does it say? It is a great organizer of material, and such will save countless man hours in execution, which it still sort of does today, although not really. I guess you still see people don't use it really all that much. A lot of designers, again, don't really understand it. A lot do. Grid structure is actually one of the things that you would hope that your graphic designer, if you're using one, would actually understand that. But a lot of them, unfortunately, a lot of them don't, and a lot of them will break out of the grid. A lot of them won't see the grid when they're actually doing stuff, and that's a real concern. Also help bring continuity to various diverse publications. The multitude of grids which can be developed and used by the designer. In the illustration below, we explore the rudiments of a grid and its application on a hypothetical publication. So it's just sort of showing the structure of how it's sort of then building this sort of grid system and then actually populating it, which is really quite nice. This is again something that this is Design 101, and it's one of those sorts of things that, if you know that it should be there, you'll see it automatically, but as I say, a lot of designers won't see it, and that's a big problem if that's the case. Clients often won't see it, but that's because usually grids work on a subconscious level, and so if you're somebody that's not actually a graphic designer and thinking, "Hey, I don't really see it in things," don't worry. It works on the subconscious. It doesn't work on a conscious level. It's so most of what we talk about with design is actually it's almost like the body language of the words on a piece of paper. It's the body language that communicates a lot about what's actually being said. And so it then just goes through relating cover and interior. I've now gone well over time, even with this one. So we've got different grids in through here. We're just keeping consistency through the publication. This is really good stuff, actually. This is actually something that this is a basic principle of design. And so when people were sort of trying to figure out what they needed to do, they would do this. And now a lot of programs will actually do this now for you as well. That'll help you along. Again, just getting consistency through everything. I won't read all this sort of stuff, but if you're wanting to read it, just pause and have a bit of a read. I better sort of keep on shuffling along. Advisable to use one column for formats in small brochures and folders. Grids can be employed. Now, there used to be like a rule of thumb as to how many characters should actually be in a standard line of text to make it more legible. I think it was 48 characters was the golden number to make it so you didn't have to bob your head around to actually read stuff, which this would be about right. See how they've got it in 2 columns? If this was 1 column, you'd have to move your head to actually read it. And so it would be hard to read. And so this is actually where grids would be very, very useful. Also, because you had to specify your type setting, you just set galleys of type based on your grid format, and then it would just come back and you then just cut it up and sort of paste it down onto the actual art itself on the art boards. But again, they've just got the grid sort of worked out really quite nicely, and through here everything's sort of working quite well. Interior grid formats, again, just sort of showing how things can be worked out. This is a good way of actually thumbnailing anything you're doing anyway, to be honest. Just like I still do stuff like this, where I sort of just sketch it out and just draw it in. It's a really cool way of doing things. So it's just talking about grids. This is really good stuff. Interior grid formats, news publications, just going through the same sort of thing as what you can do through there. Again, I've run out of time, which is unfortunate, because I wouldn't have minded sort of reading through this stuff. Interior grid formats, quality publication, so it's actually now sort of going into like 3-column formats with different bits and pieces. Again, this is interesting how they've actually tried to keep a solid grid line this far off the base of the page. Very nice, actually. That's a really nice sort of treatment. Again, it would look great today. You know, it's just as good today as it would have back then. It's interesting because they've actually gravitated inside here a comfortable amount. Their gutters in between their columns are a lot less than the areas on the outside here than their margins. Yet the examples that they showed didn't show anything like how good this is. So it's funny that they can do it in here, but not on the other stuff. Yeah, it's just interesting. So this is case-bound educational publications, allowing usually 4 extra space in the gutters. Don't know if it'll tell you that, because when things were case-bound, yeah, normally there'd be sort of like a minimum requirement. You'd have to sort of find out what that actually was. So they need a lot of space for things that were sort of bound in different ways. Oh God, there's still all this signage and that, and we haven't even looked at this yet. I won't go through this. I think I'll just leave this alone. I'll just quickly go from page to page where it's just sort of showing the various sort of stuff. Again, this is sort of funny that they've done it this way with the NASA on the right and then this coming off the side, whereas this actually does anchor with the range left, ragged right, and this one doesn't really require it. So it's a funny way of actually sort of doing it. I think they've done it to try to balance it up, but I prefer to have the NASA Langley Research Centre with the National Aeronautics coming off the other side of it, to be honest. A bit like this. And this is interesting to see how much leading they've put in between the Alpha Omega Corporation. See how the gravitation, it's not gravitating back towards even its own statement. It's actually going off a little bit. I don't know if it says that anywhere in here. But these look wrong to me. They're not, the actual leading between it is now different to what we've seen elsewhere in the actual document itself. See how this is tighter than this is? So this, for me, at least it gravitates towards each other, whereas these are too open and this is too open. Anyway, it's just me. Going back through, yeah, look, I'll skip all of this stuff, I guess. It's just going through the actual treatments. But God, this is a good document. As I say, the link will be in the description, so have a bit of a look at it. The motor vehicle area through here, God, do I go back and come back and talk about this stuff or not? I mean, everything's done so differently nowadays. Everything is done so differently nowadays. Yeah, this would have been hand painted. They would have either been cut out of acetate and then sprayed on, or even painted with a brush. A lot of the stuff that would have actually been done. And then from there it went to, like nowadays you just do it all digitally, but yeah, it's really very, very different back in this era as to how things would have actually been done, where they actually would have put this stuff on. I mean, the era that followed this, you'd have magnetic panels that would sort of stick on things. I don't know if it'll tell you using grayscale. Yeah, maybe this would have been cut out. Actually, no, the lettering there may have even been rub-on lettering. They wouldn't have had computer cut lettering back in this era, but computer cut lettering came in the 1980s, where they could actually then like cut out the actual letters on computer. I don't know if those would have been painted on. It would be interesting to sort of see a vehicle from this era to see whether it was actually painted or whether it was computer cut. I don't know when computer cut lettering came in, where the vinyl lettering came in. Again, it's interesting to sort of see this. It's sort of like looking at a little snapshot of history. It's sort of been sprayed at the bottom here, and then some sort of treatment there. Actually, that's interesting. They've actually now got the they've got the actual specification of the actual gloss enamels, but not the brand. Oh, gloss enamels from the federal standard colour system. So they're using it here, but not for the printing. Interesting. That's very, very interesting. Gloss enamels. So this means it's painted. That's the white and blue. Actually, no, that's the back. That's the areas in through here. God, how much more have we got? How much more have we got? Yeah, I think I'll just skip on through. But this is a really, really interesting document. Really interesting document. God, I don't want to make another version. We're at 45 minutes already on this one. I think I'll just finish it off because I think we're now at the end anyway, even aeroplanes and stuff. Yeah, look, I'll leave it here with all the examples, but it is interesting to sort of see this once again the specification and how different it is nowadays. There's the space shuttle, spatial discovery. Yeah, interesting. Very, very interesting. Actually, I'm not sure when that one went into space. Was that around 76 when this one would have been built? I think this was the first use was on the space shuttles. Yeah, interesting. And then of course we've got the other. What was this one for? Not sure what the space telescope was. That the Hubble? Hubble wasn't 70s, was it? That was 1990s, wasn't it? Or was it done this far back? Interesting stuff, though. Again, certificates and awards. We'll skip past. Actually, that's interesting. They've actually used different fonts in here. I think. Oh no, maybe that's the that might be the Garamond that's been used in through that side. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, Decals and Decals. Okay, so maybe they did actually have computer cut lettering back in through here. So it's available in the form of Decals only, dry application, pressure sensitive, adhesive back vinyl. Okay, so yeah, they must have been able to print onto vinyl at this stage. So Decals wet application. Yeah, okay, the wet application ones would have been sort of like a stick-on sort of vinyl. So yeah, they would have used Decals back in through here. So I was wrong about the need to paint it on. Decals are specified below for use on transparent surfaces like windows, doors, etc., and obtained by NASA installations as required. Decals are not available at NASA headquarters because of limited requirements. Please note that the neither Decals, which I've never heard that terminology, but it must just be vinyl, nor Decals are intended for use on vehicles. Okay, whereas within a decade they were. A more permanent method of identification for vehicles is dealt with in the vehicles section of the manual. Okay, what does it say? I have to go and have another look. I have to find out what it is. I think it's painted. It must be painted on. It must be painted on because vinyl was definitely, by the 1980s, vinyl was definitely the way that you would then do that with computer cut lettering. In fact, maybe the 1990s was even when computer cut became all the rage. Here we go. Got the NASA uniform patches. So this would have been embroidered, I guess. Embroidered, I don't think it's changed that much. Yeah, I think that would have been the way that they would have done that. So that would have been an old technology. Again, it's interesting to sort of, even that makes me sort of think, I wonder when embroidery did actually sort of, because I know that they computerise embroidery now, and that's actually still an art form to actually do that effectively. But back in this era, you did have to you had to program the actual the way it would then work. With machines, and I don't know if they had them in the 1970s or not. I'm guessing they would have, because embroidery and anything to do with clothing seems to sort of be a little bit ahead of the curve with a lot of the technology with things for one reason or another. Anyway, that's it. Actually, that's the end of it, guys. We're at the final stage of this particular presentation. Hope you found it enjoyable. It's been a real nostalgic and good fun look for me to actually go through this and just sort of look at the history of what's happened and just how much the technology has changed in the previous 40 years since this was actually sort of done. It's really, really interesting. 45 years or whatever it actually was. A lot of technology changes, a lot of changes in jobs that people had back in this era that no longer exist, with jobs that would never even been thought of back in this era, simply because of the graphic sort of technology that we're looking at. Yeah, very, very fascinating. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I hope this was, as I say, a fun expose into the NASA worm logo that is now being reinstated. Thanks for your time.